Again, we appreciate everybody coming out this evening to help us to open up our second, I guess we're turning into an annual project now with Kennesaw State University. This year's project that the Globalization Academy worked with was dealing with the art of oral history, which I'm sure Dr. Harker will talk about more in just a moment and kind of give you guys a little bit of a better idea of how oral history is conducted in the scope. Thematically, the project that our globalization students have worked pretty hard on all year actually has not only been in sort of gaining the skills necessary to conduct oral history, but also to put a product into motion as well. And this year's product, this year's theme, is dealing with immigration, specifically immigration in the state of Georgia, and how immigration patterns into the state of Georgia sort of mirror and reflect immigration patterns on a global level, really, since the 1970s and this current wave of immigration that we're in. So we're very thankful to the students from our Globalization Academy sophomore cohort this year working on this. We're extremely thankful to Dr. Richard Harker from Kennesaw State University for basically working pro bono for us every year. We're working with our students and kind of giving them that extra element of history that they would not otherwise get. And I would say probably huge thanks also goes out to, and he'll be speaking as well, Mr. Brendan Witness, for really kind of grabbing the bulls by the horns on this particular project this year and really taking the lead in terms of a teacher with these guys. So we really appreciate that.
All right. So this is the culmination of a project that we started in August, and the Globalization Corps has worked really hard on this project, and I've been surprised by their enthusiasm and their professionalism. So I just want to give a quick round of applause to them. I'd like to thank Mr. Harker for coming to my classroom and giving me a day off pretty much every month since August. I got to go get coffee, talk to other teachers, and do other stuff while he was, working. And I also like to thank the board for the opportunity to do this and to be part of the Globalization Academy. And just the parents, because I know with projects like these, you have to do a lot of the work, getting your kids places and helping them out and supporting them. And there were a few parts of this project that were sort of open-ended and it required a lot of problem solving. And so I know there was some angst and some consternation as we progressed through this project. So I really appreciate all of your parents for supporting you and helping make this night possible. So will you guys applaud your parents, please? All right, as I said, this is the culmination of a project that we started in August and that we've been working towards all year. And I think this is a great venue for them to show off what they're doing and to get a lot of really important skills for the future. But I want them to talk about it, and I want Dr. Richard Harker to talk about it. And so will the panelists come up here? And then,
So let me ask you a question while they're getting settled. How many of you in the audience know what oral history is? Okay. How many of you have never heard that term before? How many of you have heard that term but do not know what it means? It's okay. Put your hand up. Well, that was kind of the position that our students were in. That's kind of the position our students were in when we got started in August. And Mr. Pearl and Mr. Witness came to me and they said, can we do a project for a year where we have our students thinking about Georgia and their local communities, but also thinking about the world and how those two things are connected? And so we brainstormed and we came up with this idea of using oral history to talk about immigration. And really, to me, the wonderful thing about oral history is that it allows us to see the world through new eyes and different eyes. When we talk about oral history, what we're talking about is interviewing people. And so as an oral historian, unlike most historians who go into archives and read manuscripts, oral historians are the only historians who deal exclusively with living people. And that's great, because so much of the historical record is written by the people who are in power. And oral history allows us to hear from people who maybe don't have a ton of power or a ton of access to put in their words and their stories out there. And so it allows us to uncover people's stories in a way that perhaps we can't otherwise. And so as we started to explore oral histories with the students, we also started to encounter some of the problems, which is when you're interviewing someone and you're asking them to tell you about their life, you find out that people have memories that aren't always sharp, or they want to romanticize the past, or they want to tell you a certain story because they feel guilty about something that happened in the past. And so as oral historians, we're also always reckoning with the fact that oral history is not unproblematic. That's a double negative. Wow, I like that. Which is to say, it is problematic. There's many problems with it. And so as a class, we've been thinking about that and working through that, and also not only learning the skills of interviewing and active listening and knowing when to ask follow-up questions, but also learning about immigration and talking to different immigrants about their stories. And finding out that when you start talking to real people about something which is so political and something that is in the news almost every day, you actually realize that there's very rarely two people that share the same point of view about this very complicated thing. And so in a moment, I'm going to ask the students some questions to sort of reflect on their experience so that you can hear what they've been learning about. But let me ask to begin with, are there in the audience anybody that has been interviewed by our students this year? And if so, can you stand up and receive a round of applause for your time and energy? And the reason we thank you so sincerely is because being interviewed is hard. Being asked to recall personal stories is difficult, especially when it's something so personal and also something so potentially controversial as immigration. That's a difficult thing. So we really do appreciate all of your time and energy and giving our students your reflections and your stories. But now, let us turn to this wonderful group of students who have been thoughtfully engaging with oral histories all year and then turning them into podcasts. And afterwards, you're going to be able to hear how they went about doing that and listen to those podcasts. But let's begin at the far end, and we'll just kind of go down so everybody knows who everybody is. Introduce yourself, who you work with, if that person is not on the stage, and what your podcast is about. You can sit down. Just talk towards the microphone.
Lean towards the floor mic. It has a green light on it.
I'm Spencer Van Muskie.
Lean towards the floor.
I'm Spencer Van Muskie. I work with Jake Seawood. We interviewed Mr. Kayla Happy, who's from the
I'm Jenna Paramich. I worked with Abby McDonough, who's over there. And I worked with Benita Vijay, and she's from Kuwait in India.
I'm Karen Lee, and I worked with Christine Lee, who's sitting there, and we interviewed Mr. Hee Sung Shin, who is here tonight with us also.
I'm Lindsay Ryan. I worked with Natalie over there, and we interviewed an immigrant from Georgia named Soko.
I'm Margarita Gazelle. I worked with Isabel Libasada, and I interviewed Miss Elizabeth Lichtenberg, and she is the daughter of a Colombian and a Cuban immigrant.
I'm Charlie Matheson, and I worked with Connor Kraus, and we interviewed Ms. Tancredi, our Spanish teacher, and she's from Venezuela.
I'm Sydney Sanders, and I interviewed Mrs. Maya Venkatachalam, who is an immigrant from India.
I'm David Waterlove. I worked with Manu Patel, and I interviewed my grandfather, who's also named David Waterlove, and he's from Scotland.
I'm Molly Mari. I worked with Leanne Kleinman, and we interviewed Nir Kleinman, who's from Israel.
So as you can see, it's a pretty diverse group of narrators that we heard from, and we heard all of their different stories. But I have a question just for anybody who wants to get us started, which is, what new perspectives about immigration did you all get from this project this year?
All right, so I interviewed a person from Scotland, as previously mentioned, so it kind of gave me a perspective that isn't normally addressed when it comes to immigration issues, as most immigration issues that are talked about today involve Latin American immigrants or immigrants from those regions of the world, while modern immigrants from Europe usually aren't taken into account when it comes to these issues because they aren't the big, most interesting issues. And because it's been happening for so long, you don't really hear about it as much. So learning from that kind of perspective and learning about my family lineage was new and really interesting to me.
Did it change your sort of relationship with your family in any way to sort of hear some stories that maybe you didn't hear before?
Well, it did, because it kind of gave me a perspective onto why they view things in certain ways, and it made me understand why for example, my dad, he was my grandfather's son. And it helps me understand why he appreciates certain things that I wouldn't normally, because he wouldn't have those things where he was born. So it's a new thing that I wouldn't have thought of previously.
What about anyone else? What did you hear?
Well, you hear all the statistics in the news about immigrants and current, what David was saying with current immigration statistics, but doing this project really helps put things into perspective that everyone affected by immigration, be they an immigrant themselves or the child of an immigrant, they all have their own different perspective and their own different points of view, and sometimes that's hard to remember. That it can be a perspective, it can be just as much perspective as it is a statistic that you'd hear on CNN or something.
Charlie?
Interviewing Miss Tancredi was also an eye-opener because I've known her for most of the year already when I interviewed her, because she was my Spanish teacher. So while interviewing her, it was just interesting to see her perspective as someone that I've known pretty well, and it gave me a better view on the actual perspectives from the interviews.
And what new things did you learn by interviewing her that perhaps changed how you thought about her or your experiences?
Well, just knowing the immigration process as a whole, the things you have to go through, knowing the hardships going through immigration, going through green cards and all the other steps to take. And it was just, it got me on a personal level, it got me to understand what someone has to go through by seeing her as more person that I know instead of just a person used by the media or just a person that you don't know as well.
Anyone else?
Well, I thought it was kind of cool. We interviewed several different immigrants. We also interviewed immigrants from Vietnam and Colombia, and I thought it was interesting to see, listen to their stories, and it kind of made it clear that everybody's story is kind of different, and there's pretty different stories, and it's kind of cool to listen.
Tell me more about that. That's my interview follow-up question.
The reasons why in the United States, the Colombian immigrant actually had a really interesting story. He was in Kansas, Colombia, and the drug cartel threatened his life, so he moved to the United States. And so he became a part of it. And then Miss Uehara, her husband, wanted to immigrate to the United States with him, and that's how she was.
Was there anything that surprised you all about conducting these interviews? Or what surprised you about conducting these interviews?
Well, I was sort of surprised how willing people were able to talk about their lives, how something so personal could be turned into a story that we could share with everyone. And then also, I was also surprised by how people were afraid to also give information. I had one experience where I had to, me and Abby, we went to a Mexican restaurant called Cazadores, and we asked one of the people if we could interview them, and in light of recent events in the news, it was the day after Trump's election. She was unwilling
sit down that and go take like that easy. Yeah.
Like Jenna was discussing that how everything kind of turned political, I was kind of surprised in how when conducting my interview, everything kind of turned really political. Just like Jenna said, in light of recent events, that's not really something that you can escape. But like as much as you try, everything and everyone's immigration backstory always has to tie into current events and impacts how people's lives run in modern times and in their lives now. So that was
I also think that like the recent events that you guys have been mentioning kind of helped me to realize the scope of this project isn't just like for school or something. It really helped me to go through like my newsfeed and realize, okay, there's a bunch of stuff going on with immigration, immigrants from all over. And so that kind of, the recent events in the news helped us to focus in on our project as more than a project, but more like a world event.
And besides learning about political issues for immigrants, we also learned through the interview about social issues after the immigration process. So even though for some the immigration process was quite difficult and you had to go through the process of obtaining a green card and stuff, but after you got to the United States, it was still pretty difficult adjusting to the lifestyle because of the culture's like differences, and we learned that immigrants face a lot of prejudices and stereotypes while living in the United States.
Did that surprise you?
Well, it kind of did, but kind of didn't, because I know that stereotypes have been, well, they've always been an issue, but they've become better as people have gotten a better education in like in the 21st century. But I just wasn't aware that it was like still such a big thing.
And also kind of along the lines of those issues, like in my podcast and interview process, I learned that it's not just immigrants who look different that experience these kind of prejudices. The person I interviewed had a different accent and dressed differently, had different like culture than people lived in America, but looked similar to most people who lived here. So you like, as he would talk to people, he would have an accent, and people would kind of write him off as just another like a different person who was different from them, and they wouldn't want to associate. So it kind of opened up the perspective that it's not just people who look different, but it's also how people sound and their cultures that separate people.
Well, going off of that, there's prejudices. Well, with my person that we interviewed, he moved to the United States when he was really little. So he really grew up in the American culture, and he like grew up that way. But when he was a young adult, he moved back to Israel. So he received prejudices from his own like home country because he acted the way that an American would act. So he struggled in like fitting back into the culture of where he was from, but also when he moved back to the United States, he had to learn again like the American way, which was a challenge.
I think what's so interesting about hearing your talk is that you can start to hear how there's so many different layers to this project, and you start to interview someone about their immigration experience, and suddenly you find yourself talking about prejudice or society or culture or what it means to be American, and it sort of just spirals outwards and outwards. And I think as we hear this wonderful group of students talk, we also start to realize that there's just a sort of a wonderful world of diverse stories that we can hear about. What all are your biggest takeaways from this whole project, whether it's about immigration or history or anything else?
I think my biggest takeaway would probably be gaining perspective, and that's one thing that I can account to learning about oral history is gaining perspective and how everything has a point of view from whatever source it comes from, and that's something I can apply to like my career or my future years as a student.
Well, I was sort of, well, not surprised, but oral history, I've learned that like oral history provides you like a timeless type of news and media that you can look to if you want to gain information. So it's something that's so timeless and modern that it's when it's gone, it's gone. You have to get it when it's going on. So really that was interesting to me. know that immigrants, everyone's different. So, like I realized how easy it is for lawmakers to categorize everyone into a single category, and really interviewing a bunch of different people from very different places, Israel, Kuwait, and India. It really showed me that everyone's story is very different.
Well, my biggest takeaway was honestly learning these interview skills that we didn't have before, because we did some pre-interviews before we conducted our hour-long interview with a person, and it was stuff that like we can use in the future, because none of us had really ever experienced sitting down and talking with someone we weren't really comfortable with for a straight hour and trying to keep a conversation going, like and keep it on track. So those valuable skills that we'll definitely use again.
And also, like, kind of adding onto the oral history ideas, like, you realize how different oral history is from any other kind of history, because you can read a textbook as much as you want, or like read articles or anything like that. But until you hear the emotion that some people have in their voices when it comes to these topics and talking about their life stories, until you hear that, like, that tone in their voice, you don't really understand the history behind a subject. So this kind of history really opens up what events really were, because you can feel the emotions that other people have in those situations.
Building.
Sorry. I was just gonna say, it also, like, building off of what David said, it kind of helped us to challenge the traditional media that we're used to hearing about, like Jenna said, the one story, and kind of categorizing all immigrants the same. It helped us kind of to learn that hearing a story firsthand is a lot more powerful, and you gain a lot more from it, and you kind of get to humanize this person that you have been hearing about on the news or wherever you've been hearing about it.
Building off, I would also like to build off what David said. What he said about textbooks, and usually textbooks try to be as neutral as possible, but what I learned from oral history is that everything is truly like bias, and instead of trying to be neutral, you could use the bias to your advantage and turn it into like something you could like use it to like gain perspective.
Yeah, we talked a lot about that, right? Sometimes hearing how people tell their stories gives us as much perspective as what they're saying, and we can learn a lot from that as well. Are there any final thoughts or ideas that you want to share with the whole room before we make our way to the cafeteria so that you can showcase your podcasts for the very first time in public? Did you enjoy the process?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's cool.
Except for transcripting, but
Transcripting.
Oh, yeah, transcribing.
Oh, either way.
Yeah. Well then, I think this is the appropriate moment to transition to listen to the podcast. But before we do that, can we have everybody give a big round of applause to all of the speakers? And they are going to be in the cafeteria with their podcast so that you can go and listen to them. The podcast is going to be on the internet, and they're also free.